Today, I'd like to start us on a little trip through the spirituality of George Harrison. George is known, of course, as a famous member of the Beatles, great songwriter, a great musician. But it's interesting to take a look at his life from the point of view of his spiritual journey and how he encountered God and how he found peace in his life. A very difficult life, a very challenging life as star, as one of the most famous people in the world, initially as a Beatle. How did George start out? His parents were Harold Harrison, a bus driver, his mom Louise. They had a daughter, Louise, and they had two other sons, Harold Jr. and Peter. George, interesting, during this last pregnancy, George being the youngest, Louise listened to a program on music from India every Sunday. And it's going to be fascinating to see the influence of India and particularly Indian music on George. And you wonder any relationship between the fact that mom listened to this music during the pregnancy and the interest that George developed. You never know. He was born on February 25th, 1943, at his family's home. The extended family would gather for singing sessions around a wind-up gramophone. So obviously music was part of the family experience. Liverpool, the city that George was born in, was really a city in ruins after the war. It had been bombed frequently, and you'd walk around the city and there'd be all these bombed out buildings. They were in the process of rebuilding, so difficult in terms of what George would experience on an everyday basis in the family as they walked around the city. Liverpool also noted for its gangs, so a tough city and not an easy city to grow up in. So in 1949, the Harrisons moved to a larger home in Spec A, 45 minutes by bus from central Liverpool, so out there in the suburbs. George, very interestingly, had scary dreams when he was younger. And these followed him very much into adulthood. He would dream, a frequent aspect of these dreams is he would dream that he was very small and other people towering over him. He loved plants. He also had a love when he was younger for race cars. He especially loved music. He listened to the music of Jimmy Rogers, Big Bill Bronzy, Slim Whiteman, and Hank Williams. He got his first guitar when he was 10 years old to kind of follow and pursue this love of music. His mother, Louise, very much encouraged him. She loved music herself. His father did not because he's like, you're not going to make a living at this. I mean, you've got to be real in terms of your interest and what you're going to be working with. And music for dad wasn't, the way to go. Their daughter attended college. Louise attended college for training as a teacher. Harry and Peter pursued apprenticeships. Harry as a mechanic, and Peter doing panel beating and welding. His father wanted George to become an electrician. He thought very much important to have a good trade. You're going to create a solid life for yourself. And as the boys pursued their trades, so, George was encouraged to go in that direction as well. His father was very brilliant. He scheduled all the buses in Liverpool, which was quite extensive, difficult to do, and his father, Harold, did a very good job with that. In terms of his religious upbringing, George was raised as a Catholic. His mom, a very devout Catholic, but he thought it didn't make sense. He said, we're all sons of God. We're all related to God. Why is there's such emphasis on this particular religion. He had a more generalized sense of religion. That was his insight, that we are all related to God, and particular religions he kind of shied away from. He skipped his confirmation, did make his first Holy Communion, his baptism, but confirmation, he didn't bother with that. And one of the reasons why he gave for not pursuing confirmation was very interesting. He was upset that so many pubs were located near churches. So he said, hey, you're trying to find God and you're trying to find peace and commune with the Lord, but all these people are in pubs. Very similar insight to Martin Luther. He was very upset in his town that so many people would go to religious services, would go to missions, would get their indulgences, but then would wind up in pubs. He said, there's something wrong about this. George was very bright. He was accepted into the Liverpool Institute, which was a challenge, a tough place to get into, but he didn't care for it. And he didn't like it. He didn't feel comfortable there, and so he dropped out. George was frequently ill. He suffered from tonsillitis and at 13 developed nephritis and had to spend 6 weeks in the hospital, which for a young lad, obviously a difficult situation. He had dreams of a career in rock and roll. That was always his ambition. He wanted to be involved in rock and roll. And in 1956, rock and roll started to be heard on British radio. This young 13-year-old fascinated by it. We started to listen to Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and he met George McCartney on a bus. He was riding a bus in 1956, and they started to practice together. They just kind of struck up a conversation. Paul said, I'm involved with music. George said, I love music too. And Paul belonged to a band. The band was called the Quarrymen. He was 9 months older than George. And he knew John Lennon, who was 3 years older than George. And John attended the College of Art. He always had this love for art, John Lennon. And they rehearsed constantly. They would get together, they loved rehearsing, they loved playing together, and they were called the Silver Beatles. Stuart Sutcliffe was the fourth member. And they traveled, the band, to Hamburg, and they weren't too successful there initially. When they came back to England, Chas Newby stood in for Stuart, and they added Peter Best on drums. George's mom was very encouraging. She saw them, practicing and getting involved with this, and she thought, oh, this is a good thing to pursue it. They returned to Hamburg then in 1961, and Brian Epstein became their manager. And it was interesting how he became their manager because there were requests for their record in his record shop. And so he said, wow, there's an interest here. And so he said, well, I'll manage you, I'll help you get started. Stuart Sutcliffe died of a brain hemorrhage resulting from an attack at a dance that the band did. A difficult circumstance for all the band members, and a lot of times in these scenes there were these difficult situations, and this was very difficult on them. He was only 21, 2 years older than George at the time, and certainly that had a profound effect on George, the death of Stuart. EMI Records was interested in signing them, and George Martin was the producer there at EMI Records. And so they replaced Peter Best with Richard Starkey, later known, of course, as Ringo. 1963, their popularity grew. They were on television, and they had a #1 hit, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And then we're going to see what happened to them as they became even more and more popular.